Welcome to JoBlo Horror Videos Playing with Fear, where we take a look at some of the landmark horror titles throughout the history of gaming. Today we're looking at what is a fairly obvious choice for a game adaptation, with the only oddity being that it was released so late into the series' life. Saw took audiences and theater chains by storm in late October of 2004, and the licensed game Saw would get released in October of 2009. That would end up being just a few short weeks before the sixth installment of the film series. It's pretty much exactly what you'd think it would be, but how does it fare as a game and compared to the series of horror movies it's based on?
Most people are so ungrateful to be alive, but not you. Not anymore.
James Wan and Leigh Whannell would have a mega hit on their hands when Saw was released on October 29, 2004. I was personally blown away at 19, leaving the theater wanting more and trying to comprehend what I'd just seen, as it was different than anything I'd ever seen before in my life. 2 years later, Hostel would come out and ramp up the gore, but lose some of the cerebral aspects of Saw. Don't get me wrong, I really enjoy Hostel as well, but Saw is a whole different animal. The independent movie that could would also be the new yearly Halloween tradition. In a cinematic world of straight-to-video sequels or flat-out stagnation in horror franchises, Saw would crank out films nearly every year for a good while. While the critical praise would never match the first film, every entry made more than enough money to justify moving forward with a sequel. The first 7 would be released every October from 2004 to 2010, with a few more coming in 2017, 2021, and the 10th coming up in 2023. In addition to every single one being released theatrically, getting to 10 movies in a horror series is quite the accomplishment. In addition to making careers for James Wan and Leigh Whannell, who would go on to give us some really great stuff, Saw was very popular, and when a franchise is popular, it gets both stuff and things. Merchandise would flow with toys, apparel, decorations, and it would lend itself wonderfully to mazes at Universal Studios' Halloween Horror Nights. While there are shockingly no comic books or novels based on the property, the allure of a video game being just too much, and with horror games being incredibly popular, the world of Saw would be transported to the 7th generation of consoles.
Let the game begin.
As the third movie was approaching release, we would get our first announcement for a game for the franchise with the idea of releasing it concurrently with the already announced fourth film. Brash Entertainment was the studio that was going to develop and release the game with the help of Twisted Pictures, the studio in charge of all the movies. Brash is an interesting choice, as they'd only done kids games up to that point like Alvin and the Chipmunks and Space Chimps for the PS2. Brash would struggle to stay above water though, and the game would be passed to Zombie Studios. And even though that's a great horror name for a game studio, they made their name with the Spec Ops games from the late 90s to early 2000s. Since Lionsgate wasn't in the games business, they decided they needed a publisher as well, and this time they chose a heavy hitter. Konami stepped in, and this would probably make most horror fan games jump for joy, as the studio was the owner of the famous Silent Hill series, which is indisputably on the Mount Rushmore of horror game series. Saw would release on October 9th, 2009 for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, much closer to Saw 6's release, with a PC port coming October 22nd, just a day before the movie premiere. The game opens up with Detective David Tapp waking up in Whitehurst Asylum with the popular reverse bear trap attached to his head. Tapp is Danny Glover's character from the first film, who has clearly survived somehow, and the story takes place between the first and second films. Tapp gets out of the trap after watching a video from everyone's favorite puppet, Billy. Well, it's voiced by series villain Jigsaw, but Billy is sort of the mascot, along with Pighead. We'll see Pighead later, too. Tapp escapes his room by finding the combination to the door lock written on the bathroom stalls. Tapp starts running into people and quickly realizes that he is not alone in the asylum. He has his own game to play to escape, but he's also a central figure in everyone else's game, as inside his body is the only key to escape this nightmare. David goes through the asylum, avoiding traps both obvious with glass on the ground for his bare feet and hidden like shotgun traps attached to the doors, syringes in toilets, and acid in barrels, along with some other franchise staples. Tapp's game involves saving a few select hostages while fighting his way through the maze, avoiding traps and other victims, and solving puzzles. The first of his victims to save is Amanda, who we all know as someone who survived her game and later becomes an apprentice for Jigsaw. While searching around the asylum, David will find notes about the asylum as well as notes from Jigsaw about what's going on. After a brief time with Amanda, she's taken away by Pigmask, and Tapp has to push on before he too is taken to another location. He wakes up in another part of the asylum, this time with an exploding collar that will react and blow up in close contact with others wearing theirs. The next person that is part of David's game is Jennings Foster, who he finds stuck in a pendulum-type trap. Jennings is freed and flees to try to find a way out of the building, and if the name is familiar, it's because he's another detective from the films that apparently killed a man in a hit and run and framed another guy for it, which is kind of why he ended up part of the game. David makes his way through a ton more traps and finds various weapons to use, including a gun. He eventually runs into Melissa Singh, the wife of his partner that died chasing Jigsaw in the first film, and saves her from another nasty trap. Despite being saved, Melissa still hates David as she blames him for her husband's death. She leaves and locks David in another wing of the hospital. Tap next finds Oswald McGillicuddy, which is the actual name they used, I assure you, a reporter who has followed Jigsaw's crimes but who Jigsaw feels didn't understand or report the message properly and needs to be in the game. Tap saves him from a trap setup, but he's killed quickly after tripping a trap ahead of Tap, and now I'm done being Dr. Seuss for a while. David continues to move through the asylum until he finds Obi Tate, who actually put out a request in the papers to be tested by Jigsaw. David sets him free, but Tate's angry he couldn't do it himself and runs off. The final victim is Jeff Riedenauer, who was previously saved by Tap and Singh from a trap. Tap is successful and then has to fight and kill Pighead to escape. Finally, Tap is presented with two choices, a door marked Truth and a door marked Freedom. Choosing Freedom lets you out of the maze and the game ends, but David is so distraught at you not finding the answers that he takes his own life. Choosing Truth leads you to fighting Jigsaw, who you eventually defeat, only to find out that it's Melissa Singh finishing her game. She stumbles to her feet and walks directly into another shotgun death trap, dying exactly as her husband did. This is too much for Tap to take, again, and this time he ends up in an active asylum. No happy ending here, regardless of what door you take. For the record, the canonical ending is freedom, though you wouldn't find that out until the game's sequel.
He doesn't want us to cut through our chains. He wants us to cut through our feet.
The game tries to be a typical survival horror of the time. You go from room to room and section to section, doing some sort of cycle involving fighting enemies, solving puzzles, and finding key items to use. The puzzles could be as simple as reaching into something gross or painful to find something needed, or reconfiguring a power grid, or, when they ran out of ideas, one of those dumb picture puzzles where you have to slide the sections around to put together the picture properly. Unfortunately, the entire game looks pretty much the same wherever you go, with the exception of your brief stint outside, and all the puzzles just start repeating themselves, just getting larger in scale. Combat is usually a one-on-one with handheld weapons, and eventually firearms, but the close combat is pretty rough in both looks and execution. Firearms do the trick best, but you can also scavenge for parts and build your own traps to set that, frankly, don't work the way you want them to in-game. All of the enemies fight the same, but do look different based on what part of the game you're in and what traps they have associated with them. The only exception to this is fighting the only boss of the game with Pighead, and even then they just look slightly different than the others and have a larger health pool. With the game being released in 2009, it looked like a lot of other third-person titles, and the graphics don't really hold up compared to today or the lovingly crafted 8 and 16-bit games of the past. Health items can be picked up to save for later or used immediately depending on if they're bandages or health hypos. You start the game with a lighter to see in the dark, and that can eventually be upgraded to a flashlight, which is easier to use and lets you see more. The random notes you can find would have been cool if they were personalized, but they all read in the same lame-looking pop-up box when you find them. While the characters sometimes exist from the previous films, only Tobin Bell lends his voice to the cast returning as Jigsaw, and he sounds about like he does in the rest of the series. Earl Alexander plays Tap, and he would have small roles in the far superior Suffering games from a few years prior, while Cortana herself, Jen Taylor, lends her voice as Amanda. It's cool and they do a good job, but it would have been more fun if they could have secured the original actors, or, if Tap looked anything like Danny Glover. All in all, it's an inferior survival horror game that could have been great with the license it had and Konami producing it.
Those who don't appreciate life do not deserve life.
This game should have been scary, but then I guess the movies aren't really scary either. They have lots of tense moments and some jump scares, but don't really have an overall scary tone. In that sense, the game succeeds at mimicking the movies, as there are certainly jump scares from both enemies and traps, and there's tension trying to figure out the solutions of the puzzles the game presents. Unfortunately, with the stagnant number of puzzles available, this quickly wears thin and is completely lost with secondary playthroughs. Maybe played with the lights off and the sound turned up, you can get some scares out of it, but it's often too frustrating in gameplay elements to give proper fright. While I can't find sales records for the game, it must have done well enough to get a sequel, with Saw: Flesh and Blood being released just a year later from Konami and Zombie again. Both games had mediocre reviews, although seem to have cult followings nowadays. Unfortunately, both games have been removed from digital stores and they aren't exactly cheap to buy physically. I'd say seek them out if you're a die-hard Saw or die-hard survival horror fan only. With over a decade since the last release, would you like to see a new game with the new movie? Have you played either of these games? Let us know in the comments.
Sorry, we're closed.
If you had $700,000 and less than 3 weeks to shoot a horror movie with your friends, how do you think it would go? Would the limited budget and schedule cripple your creativity, or would it inspire something inside you that would lead to one of the most acclaimed genre films of the 21st century? Well, why don't we just ask these guys?
No, we had similar interests. James was talented, and I was interested in being talented. So I shared in his life. He let me come into his world, which was fantastic.
James Wan and Leigh Whannell have individually carved out their own impressive corners in the film industry, but while these days the filmmakers are working on giant studio projects and getting rich, they were once just a pair of film students who just wanted to make their first movie. A movie that would draw inspiration from the explosive success of the now iconic found footage film, The Blair Witch Project. A movie with a villain that has since become an icon, and even recently, a hero?
I still have a lot of work that needs to be done.
Folks, it's the Halloween season, and like many of you, I've been on a long bender of watching horror movies that are on my ever-growing list of seasonal rewatches. Among the titles that I just can't seem to skip is 2004's Saw. But before having sequels and spin-offs galore, Saw started as a small mystery thriller made by filmmakers with so much unique style and flair that resonated with audiences so much that the film is now hailed as a modern horror classic.
To overcome something, you have to understand what a perfect engine it is.
So, today we're gonna dive deep into the Book of Saw, revisit the first film, and determine exactly why this gritty, low-budget bathroom production is so important to horror fans almost 20 years later. I'm Kier with JoBlo Horror, and you're watching Deconstructing.
Most people are so ungrateful to be alive.
Imagine this. You wake up in a bathtub full of water and quickly realize that you have no idea where you are or why you're there. There's another person in the room with you. Two, actually. One is alive and one is dead. The living one is chained to the wall, and you soon realize that you're chained to the wall too. And the game is simple. Get out.
I want to play a game.
That's the plot of Saw, a clean and simple story about two men desperate to escape their captivity at any cost. This movie stands out as being quite an attention grabber, despite the incredibly small scope of the tale being told. It's like how we all love 12 Angry Men because the specific and small story is carried by dynamic and interesting performances and dialogue. Now, I'm not saying that the performances in this movie are anywhere near the status or prestige of 12 Angry Men, but what this movie lacks in talent in front of the camera, it makes up for with the directorial style and editing of James Wan, mixed with the sharp twist ending provided by Whannell. It was a very fresh movie at the time.
My name is very fucking confused. What's your name?
So, as usual, today we're going to break down this movie by way of our 4 key categories. First, we'll discuss the movie's origin and how it went from idea to production. Following that up, we'll get into the film's legacy, where we talk a little bit about the massive waves that this movie has made over the years. Then we'll get into a bit of trivia, so make sure you're studied up on your Saw lore, and we'll end it all off by talking about the movie's X Factor, where I'm looking for the one small thing that takes this movie from being just another bloody good time at the movies to being an iconic horror film that's well worth its weight in guts. So, if you're ready, then keep your back to the wall, and don't forget to drop a like on the video, and let's hit play on Saw.
Well, do you have any idea how you got here?
No.
As we know, Saw is the brainchild of James Wan and Leigh Whannell. The duo met in film school, and after graduating, they wanted to get to work on their first feature. They were able to come up with a working budget of about $30,000, which quickly proved to be too small of a stack for these guys to work with. So they started by shopping the script around to Australian producers and almost got a deal, but it fell through. It actually wasn't until they were on their very last leg that they decided to spend a little bit of money to get to Los Angeles and shop their movie around Hollywood. And these guys are pros, and even in the beginning, they showed that they were serious about their idea. They went as far as to package their script and pitch it with an accompanying DVD short film that would showcase the jaw trap, which has become an iconic piece of imagery for the Saw franchise. The short film provided a sample of Wan's visual style, most importantly, but it also showed the ambitious designs of the traps.
Think of it like a reverse bear trap. Here, I'll show you.
It was important for Wan and Whannell to work together on the film if it were to end up getting funded. James Wan was set on directing the film and not interested in selling the script and then just walking away. He quoted,
"Leigh and I just loved the project so much, and we wanted a career in filmmaking, so we stuck to our guns and said, look guys, if you want the project, we're coming on board. Leigh has to act in it, and I have to direct it."
And just like they'd hoped, the actor-director duo ended up getting the money and the jobs that they needed to make their movie. In fact, when producer Greg Hoffman saw the short film, he and his partners started a sister company to their production house, Evolution Entertainment, and that became the iconic Twisted Pictures, which we've seen at the top of just about every installment. Despite speculation that Whannell played the lead character as a budgetary restriction, Whannell always wanted to play the lead and was actively pursuing a career in acting at the time. I know he's not the best actor in this movie, but whatever, it gets a pass.
How do I know you're telling the truth? You could be the one who put me in this room!
The movie shot in just 18 days with only one set being built, the bathroom, and the rest were being done either on location or on borrowed film sets for other active productions. The film spends most of its runtime in the bathroom location, and about 50% of filming was spent on those scenes.
I went to bed in my shithole apartment and woke up in an actual shithole.
So, the movie was released in theaters around Halloween in 2004, and I will never forget the explosion of popularity that this movie caused. I remember all of my friends sneaking into theaters to watch this movie when we were in middle school, and I remember the Billy the Puppet merch, and I remember the insane theory that Jigsaw was just Kevin McAllister all grown up. I remember all of it.
I remember everything now.
This movie's legacy was apparent from the very beginning. It was one of those instantly iconic films, and it especially hit at a time when slashers were petering out and audiences were looking for something new. This movie inspired movies like Hostel and Would You Rather, but it also launched the vast franchise of Saw movies that have followed in the 20 years since. Hell, it just got back to its roots with the recently released prequel-sequel Saw X, and that seems to really be making its own lane at the movies.
The only thing I have not provided is your anesthetic. But trust me, you will want to remain alert.
And not to mention that it opened the door for all of the incredible work that Wan and Whannell have been able to do off of the success of this movie. There is no debating that this movie has one hell of a legacy, and part of that is because of this scene right here. This kind of imagery was not only new to audiences, but it was downright terrifying. This movie had a sense of grit and truth and reality that makes it extremely hard to watch, yet impossible to look away from. The movie demands your attention with its kinetic and wild editing style, and textured grain of the film stock, and even the iconic voice of Jigsaw.
Game over.
Which reminds me, the final twist of this movie really shook me and my friends the first time we saw it. While now, it takes a lot more to surprise an audience, at the time, the reveal that Jigsaw was in the room the entire time just felt like a huge shock. And while I don't know if it's really that impressive of a twist, it was romanticized so much at the time that I think it did help cement this film's legacy. Like, it's definitely on someone's list of best horror movie twists. You know, while the production schedule was extremely tight for this movie, James Wan still found a way to work in some of his signature style into the shots. According to Wan, he wanted the camera movements during the scenes to match the internal feelings of his characters. So you'll notice that many of the shots framing Carrie Elway's character, the shots are steady and smooth, but following that, the scenes framing Whannell's character are shaky and kinetic. This is meant to reinforce the idea that Adam is not as composed and calm as his cohort. Wan intentionally did this to help guide the character development, and obviously the same could be said for the film's editing. I think for a first-time duo, these two really showed a lot of confidence in their skills, and James Wan must have been feeling especially optimistic in the making of this movie, as he decided to forego a director's fee to instead get percentage points of the box office run. Honestly, that's bold, but if you ask Wan about the decision, he'll tell you that he doesn't regret it in the slightest. And why would he? Not only did the movie gross over $100 million, but that also means that his budget was able to be allocated to the production, so everybody wins.
What else aren't you telling me?
Well, let's see.
And before we move on, let's see if you can answer this question. True or false? The iconic Billy puppet was originally a children's ventriloquism dummy donated by Leigh Whannell that he had as a child, and it was altered with a new wig and some face paint. Comment your answers down below. Actually, the puppet was built from scratch by Wan and Whannell for the film. It wasn't a modified version of anything existing, like say Michael Myers' iconic Captain Kirk mask. Okay folks, we've been through everything from the talented filmmakers behind this movie to the fortunate and fruitful release of the movie and even the mass impact that it's had on the genre in the years since. And I'm happy to say that the X factor for this video was actually easier this time around than it has been in the past. While the movie is easy to praise solely based on the merits of its legacy, I think the standout of this movie is actually pretty clear because of the small scope. The stars had to really align in order for this movie to find its way onto the big screen. The idea was fresh and new, the filmmakers were bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and the jaw trap scene that they demoed was scary and realistic enough to get the movie funded. But all of those things could have been meaningless to the franchise if it not had been for one thing: Billy the puppet. Billy is iconic in every sense of the word. Billy is a horror icon that isn't even alive. You can't compare him to anything because he's not a conscious thing. Like, Chucky is possessed, he's the villain. In Saw, Billy is just an extension of the villain. Jigsaw's the bad guy, and Billy is just a puppet. The most iconic fucking puppet I've ever seen. Somehow, this little puppet that was only there for the sake of creepy imagery seems to be the marketing tool that has made each installment recognizable to the franchise. Tobin Bell is an amazing actor, and he's so amazing that we associate him with Billy, almost like he played dual roles. The puppet is just one of those icons that you know from your very first glance. And folks, let's never forget that Billy would kick this guy's ass.